Good evening. My name is Emmanuel Anama-Green, Jr., and I am a student at Southern Oregon University. I'm presenting to you this evening my action research project entitled Willingness to Communicate, Intervening with Skype and Google Hangouts. This was completed as one of the partial fulfillments for the Master of Arts in Spanish Language Teaching degree. A little bit about my school. I teach at Harlan County High School. We are located in eastern Kentucky on the Virginia border. Literally, if you were to look at a map and looked at the Kentucky and Virginia where they intersect, we're at the very bottom, and we border Bell County and Letcher County. We are approximately 1.5 hours from Kingsport, Tennessee, 3 hours from Lexington, Kentucky, 4 hours from Louisville, Kentucky, and about 2 hours from Knoxville, Tennessee. We are a Title I school, and we have universal free lunches and breakfast for all of our students. The reason for that is our school participates in the community eligibility option. Our rate of poverty, basically the rate of free lunches and reduced lunches, is so high at Harlan County High School that all of our students qualify for free lunch and free breakfast. The intervention that I did occurred in Spanish too. Here it's interesting and important to remember that in Harlan County High School, we only offer one foreign language world language. That, of course, is Spanish. We don't offer French, we don't offer Chinese. Basically, Spanish is it. The average class size in our classes range between 25 to 34 students. Last year, the intervention class that I had a total of 29 students, but this had fluctuated between 29 to 34 at the beginning of the school year. To give context, in the 2018-2019 year, I already have rosters with students of 34 or 35 students. My action research was created around the problem here that a lot of my students are not able to interact frequently with native speakers. They also feel willing or unwilling to communicate rather in Spanish due to not seeing a real need for speaking in Spanish. This becomes a problem because a lot of my students around here in Eastern Kentucky, they may not have the financial resources to travel to other countries or cultures, areas, and may not really be exposed to that. Additionally, if you think of field trips, it's very, very hard in our school, in our region especially, to be able to fund a field trip to a Hispanic community. I remember last year, around the end of the school year, the Spanish Honor Society was able to fundraise enough to take a field trip to Morristown, Tennessee, but this was very laborious for the students, and these were the more motivated students. The students in my classroom normally are not as motivated, and they really need to see a greater need to actually use Spanish. So I got to thinking, and I realized, why not just take my students to another country while they're still in their classroom? It's very innovative and creative, and I was wondering, why not? So I got to thinking about Skype, and I realized Skype is very affordable. There's only around a $14 monthly fee, more or less. That's for basically calling anywhere in the globe. That, those in Spanish-speaking countries, that's very helpful. And I wondered, what would it be like if I actually let the students interact with those abroad randomly with those they might see if they were perhaps walking down the street in Madrid or walking down the street in Guanajuato or wherever. Hence, the purpose of this study is to investigate the effect of conversing with native Spanish-speaking individuals who are employees of businesses in Spanish-speaking countries via the telephone feature of Skype or Google Hangouts, and we want to measure the effect of that on novice level L2 students. My research question was really simple. It's, do the levels of novice level students' willingness to communicate increase after they participate in an activity where they communicate via telephone in real time with native speakers residing in Spanish-speaking countries? The research that I did focused more so around task-based learning, technology and education, and willingness to communicate. When I found various articles, one of those that really came to light was Selig. He suggested that task-based learning with a focus on function instead of form is more effective than rote grammar drills and instruction. That article really resonated deeply with me because here where I work, we have a very strong focus on proficiency and what can the students actually do with the language versus how many verb charts they can conjugate or how many times they can memorize all the forms of ser and star and ar, eri verbs, etc. So I really appreciated that article. And it actually went in line with the intervention I'm doing too, because the idea is the students will be able to actually make a phone call and interact in the language. So that article really touched my heart in many ways. Gonzalez, Lore, and Nielsen, they contend that task-based learning with a focus on function leads to greater oral proficiency than just teaching with a focus on form approach. And further, Wang and Wang argue that beginning L2 learners feel less intimidated when they use CALL, which is computer-assisted language learning, versus speaking directly within the classroom. And again, this relates to tasks that they would actually be able to do in a task-based learning format. My research with educational technology and language learning also was very helpful. I found that Haidt and Rimrod really suggested that technology can be effective when you integrate it into more of a task-based learning activity setting in the L2 classroom. Correa suggested that Skype conference calls might be useful in promoting communication in English via computer-mediated communication for non-native speakers. They did a study, with their English students in South America there, and it was very productive. Yangua's findings were suggesting also that when students interact with Skype's audio and video features, it may possibly lead to oral proficiency improvement in the target language or in the second language. Jen also agreed with them in this area, and that telecollaborative projects are very beneficial for learners, and it helps them develop confidence and certain abilities to communicate in L2 with native speakers of that second language. So all these articles were really very helpful when I got to thinking about task-based learning and using educational technology and merging those with language learning. That really helped me a lot. Further, willingness to communicate research really helped me to see a variety of different articles. Yashima and Jansen, they found that willingness to communicate might be improved when the students actually interact in real-world tasks and not just in pretend tasks. Other researchers have found that when you use CALL and CMC, basically computer-assisted language learning and computer-mediated communication, it helps to facilitate willingness to communicate in the target language or in the second language, L2. And many others have also found that when you intervene with telecollaborative and task-based approaches, it helps really the students to really understand it and have that real-world feeling of why they're actually learning the language versus just sitting in a classroom, conjugating verbs, what have you. My participants for this study were 14 out of the 29 students in one of my Spanish 2 classes during second trimester in the 2017-2018 academic year. It's interesting to note here that even though I had 29 students, and initially that number in the school year, at the beginning of the year especially, had highlighted that it might be more, but when the actual number went down with adds and drops of classes, the number is 29. Even with that number of 29, only 14 of them opted to participate in the study. And one of the reasons for that, and when I discussed it with them, it was obvious, was that they had a fear of research and the institutional review board and the fact of being human subjects and human participants and so forth. That's somewhat of a stigma in our area. I've really tried to combat that in many ways, but still it goes back to many deep-seated feelings from years ago, and we've had some bad experiences in our area, and that's one of the reasons many of the parents chose not to let their students participate in it. Additionally, for this study, we were unable to do a control group due to the scheduling context. So we have the intervention we use was not very timely when it comes to other classes and control groups, and the scheduling with the trimester schedule especially all the classes are in the same type of setting, so it really was not possible to do that. My study design. My study design was a mixed methods research study. I used one of the willingness to communicate surveys. Basically, I took one of Yashima's surveys that was done in a different language, and I developed it and modified it per se. Basically, it's the same survey, but I modified it to Spanish versus the Asian language that he was choosing to use at that point. I engaged in a variety of focus groups, with my students. I helped them to, allow interaction between us. And immediately following the intervention, I administered the modified willingness to communicate Likert scale once again at the end of the unit. This is a little brief overview of what my study looked like. Basically, the pre-survey, was the Yashima willingness to communicate modified survey, and then of course demographics that I was able to find using Infinite Campus, which is one of our student success administration portals. Teachers are able to administer lots of grades and demographics, etc. using that program. This was prior to the intervention. The intervention occurred in the unit that had Spanish-speaking countries' influence on restaurants and foods. And the students were able to actually make their calls within the unit using what they were able to learn in Unit 2. There was also a field journal and a focus group that was around that same time period, and this culminated with a post-survey after the intervention occurred. A post-survey was in Unit 3. The duration of the study was between early December 2017 to mid-February 2018. The instructional materials at Harlan County High School, we use JCPS curriculum. That's Jefferson County Public Schools, and they are based out of Louisville, Kentucky. The reason our school chose to adopt their curriculum is because Jefferson County Public Schools curriculum is viewed as an exemplar model from the Kentucky Department of Education and many other agencies across the state. All of their prompts are designed with ACFL and state standards in mind. It's proficiency based, and the performance the students will actually do while they're in those units. So it's a really well-rounded curriculum that helps the students focus on proficiency. The procedures, this is always a very nice part that my students really enjoyed. At first there was a little nervousness, but they were actually able to make 3 phone calls to random restaurants in Spanish-speaking countries that they found using Google Maps. Basically, what that means is there was an encargador, or student basically, who operated the computer, and he or she went to Google Maps and typed in restaurants, Madrid, Spain, or restaurants, Seville, Spain, or restaurants, Guanajuato, Mexico, what have you. And then a number of red dots will populate on the Google Maps. Each of these were a restaurant, and the students would be able to make phone calls to these restaurants. They had to make 3 of them. I allowed them to use notes for the first 2 phone calls in an effort to help them learn the material and practice and to break down that barrier of that nervousness. But I did not allow that for the 3rd phone call. This also helped them to break down barriers, of course, of making phone calls to areas they've never done before, and many might not have been as familiar with actually speaking on the phone in general due to the age in which we live. And students had to be successful on each phone call. Basically, they had to have an effective introduction, they had to have 3 questions, and they had to have a conclusion. They didn't have to have perfect language skills. Actually, none of them did. But rather what they had to do is be understood by the person on the other end of the telephone. If I call the restaurant in Madrid, Spain, and I say, "Hola, buenas tardes, me gustaría información sobre el restaurante," and then I do my 3 questions and conclude, as long as that interlocutor was able to understand me and give me the information I needed at that point, I consider that to be successful for the students, because this was somewhat of a challenging task, and they were nervous at first. Then later, the majority of them, as you'll see eventually, really felt pretty good about it, and we'll talk about that later. Um, the restaurants they called were random. They were not calling back the same restaurant. So they would call one restaurant. If they weren't successful, they would choose another restaurant, and typically in the same city. If we ran out of restaurants in that city, the encargador de computadora would basically look at the map again on Google Maps and find a different city, perhaps switching continents even, going from Madrid to Mexico City in one class period, and then if we needed to at that point jump to another country. I do remember one day we were able to explore, if I'm not mistaken, well, obviously all three continents, but I think we had 2 or 3 countries in Central America, including Mexico on the North America side. And then we had Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. And of course we had Spain. So those number of countries and continents, that's pretty impressive for those students. They really were able to look at the map and basically see themselves traveling around the globe in one class period. It's pretty amazing for them. The students not making the phone calls, that's always a great question I get, were basically sitting in the classroom, but they weren't just sitting and looking at the walls, but rather they were notating various interpretive items that they heard during the phone call using an interpretive uptake chart. The interpretive uptake chart had the nombre del estudiante, and then they had the country and the city they called. They had 3 questions that were asked. They also had to notate some of the foods that they were able to hear that they had heard previously or were some new items. And then, of course, if the student was successful or not. I do recall when we were doing this that several students were so excited to hear words like paella and camarones and so many things that we'd learned and talked about, and to actually hear them in that phone call was very exciting for them, and they really appreciated it. The analysis, of course, was demographics, the pre and post surveys, as we mentioned earlier, which of course was the willingness to communicate survey that was modified off of Yashima's to be able to administer for Spanish. There was a rubric that was based on proficiency, but it was strictly more or less for information. It was not for a grade. It was to help the students see where this would actually fall on the proficiency scale if they were doing it in lifetime performing. There were focus groups and field notes, and from there, the WTC survey measured approximately 6 constructs. But the thing about it is, we couldn't really use 2 of the constructs simply because they had too few questions. We had to exempt interest in foreign affairs and, of course, reasons to study. When I collaborated with Dr. Leal, that was her suggestions, and that was really important because when we looked back at it and I realized, oh wow, that's actually not that many questions and it's really hard to give an accurate picture. I completely agreed with her on that. So the constructs we ended up measuring were motivational intensity, desire to learn Spanish, intergroup approach avoidance tendency, and interest in international vocation or activities. The emerging themes that we took from the focus group were pre-intervention preparedness, confidence following the phone call, lapse of time between Spanish 1 and Spanish 2, and the likelihood that they would use the target language outside of class, as well as post-intervention willingness to communicate, and the likelihood they use Spanish post-intervention, and the confidence, of course. The results, from the demographics, we only had 14 of them participate, and 12 participated in the post-survey, so it's a very low number. The demographics based on the pre-intervention survey data were simply 42.9% male and 57.1% female. Ages between 15 to 19, grades 10 to 12, and there were 5 10th grade students, 2 11th grade students, and 7th 12th grade students. These are some of the results that I received from the actual modified willingness to communicate survey based on Yashima. There was little change, and the results, unfortunately, were not statistically significant. However, there were some changes, although very, very, very minor. Of course, we must consider, too, that I had a very small sample to work with, 14 students, and then, of course, 12 students. That was a big deal. Due to such a small number and the outliers and so forth, I could not do a typical parametric test, but had to do a non-parametric test to analyze those. The one we did, of course, was the Wilcoxon single, as you'll see here, the Wilcoxon signed rank test, and we'll go to that momentarily. But the results in this realized that, the results would not be as significant as we would have thought. Motivation, the minimum number was 1.5 and it went to 5.67. The median, of course, was 4.1667, and the average of those, mean I should say, is 4.1905. Desire, same range there. What was interesting though, when you look down here on the post survey, the results, and before I go further, I want to let you know that the higher number due to recoding was strongly disagree, and the lower number the low number rather was closer to strongly agree. So 1 was strongly agree versus 7 strongly disagree, and that was done so that the results would be aligned and positive in nature there and so forth. So whenever you see the bar graph here momentarily, you're going to see the numbers, and it's going to look a little strange because one's going to be higher than the other, and you'll see what I mean by that. But that was basically due to recoding. And again, you see the differences here. Previously, on the pre-survey, motivation was 1.5, and then the post-survey 1.83 minimum. The maximum was 5.67 and then 5.5. So there's really non-statistically significant data at this point. Here's some of the changes though, and I personally like visuals, so the bar graph really helped me in this matter. If you look then the dark blue is the pre-survey mean, and of course the light blue is the post-survey mean. The dark blue is higher here on the bar graph, and the reason for that is, of course, due to recoding, but I really appreciated that there were some differences. The area that had the least change, of course, was vocation. That was an area that did not change at all for my students. But for motivation, desire, and intergroup, there were some changes. And of course, when you think about 14 students and then 12 students, that's, you have to consider the whole picture at that point. The statistical analysis from the Wilcox and signed rank test, basically, I had to accept all the null hypotheses, and the motivation, of course, equaled 0, intergroup equaled 0, desire 0, and vocation 0. The significance was 0.504, 0.906, 0.125, and 0.610. Basically, they were not statistically significant. And what I really, really appreciated, though, in my analysis were the results from the focus group. I've extracted some of the quotes here. I haven't done as many as I initially thought I would, but for example, the theme of intervention, the students said they were very anxious, and they'd never talked on the telephone before. This is prior to it. After the phone call, some of them said that it's now easier to speak with someone they know. They feel that their Spanish has improved. Another student said there was a lapse of time, of course, between some students, Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 courses. One of the students remarked, I felt unready because I hadn't had Spanish in 3 years. Dropping straight again into it was hard. Another one had the same or similar comment, rather. And then another one said last year they'd had it, so it's kind of easy. So there's a mixed response there from both students, or several students here. The likelihood of using the target language outside of the language class was, some of those prior to the phone call said that that would be very unlikely, since there's not that many people around here like that. And another student said they wouldn't have done a phone call in Spanish if it weren't for this class. Post-intervention, here's some really nice quotes. One of them for post-intervention willingness to communicate was, they felt good because they know nobody can speak it as good as them. That's when they made the successful phone call. And others said that they thought it would be better, and they knew it wasn't as bad as they anticipated in the past. Likelihood to use Spanish, one said their proficiency is improving, and others said they're probably a little more likely to use it now. Not guaranteeing, of course, so it wasn't really an ultra positive one, but it was kind of a so-so comment there. Confidence post-intervention, one said they can speak to harder people, another one said they like learning Spanish, and now that they've done phone calls, they feel more confident and could do it again without trouble. A discussion and conclusions. Basically, the strengths to my study were the phone calls, of course, and I really appreciated the focus group quotes because that to me, and I know as a teacher that focus group students typically might try to want to make the teacher feel good or try to respect the teacher and so forth. But still yet, some of those comments, they felt very sincere when I heard them and I saw them, and that really impacted me greatly. And they've said it to other teachers, not just to me in the focus group. You know, there were limitations. I had a very small sample size. There was an extremely short, well, pseudo-short intervention time. We had a lot of school issues last year. We had inclement weather issues, more so than we'd ever had in a while, I guess. It happens at times, but last year was one of the longer inclement weather times. And there was really a big issue that happened. One of our students in the 11th grade class, who was also one of these students' classmates, committed suicide. That was a very painful time for the whole school, not just the class, but especially the class, since it was their classmate. We also had several gun threats and active shooter threats, and many of these even made the regional newscasts. So there were a lot of limitations that happened. Focus group limitations I mentioned earlier, application to the classroom. I do believe I'm going to continue with the intervention. I definitely believe I would like to improve on certain areas, perhaps on the interventions uptake chart and the interpretive listening that they do. Perhaps other areas I'd maybe like to change on that as well. I would like to perhaps specify certain countries or have them do a curriculum unit around that or a study assignment around that. So there's lots of areas I would like to improve on. And there's opportunities to expand too. I would really like to share about this research at a local conference or in my district. In the summer, I was able to actually share in my school district a PD about how to integrate Skype and Google Hangouts, and I mentioned this intervention as well. And it could even lead to possible changes in the world languages curriculum we have. We're always up to suggestions and improvements, and this could possibly lead to improvements in that way as well. Here are some of my references. There are quite a few there, as you can see. And as we go further, my major question at this point would be if you have any questions. So if you have those questions, please let me know. I look forward to our conversation this Friday when we get to discuss this further. And if you have any questions in the interim, please let me know, and I'll gladly look into your feedback and try to find any answers I can. Thank you so much again for your help and assistance, and I look forward to talking to you on Friday.